Can you say the story, please? Uh,
Oh, you're super cutting out, Deck.
can you please tell us the story behind the joke?
So there's an old, like 1930s pulp novel slash radio show. It was called The Shadow. It's The Shadow. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of man? The Shadow knows. Is always how it would open. And for some reason, with the Phantom, I just drive right at it every time. I don't know why. It's yeah. All right. I think we're actually going to be live here momentarily. This is going to be fun.
Qu- Question for you there. You're talking about the phantom and that, and the phantasm.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever considered that the phantom could be a threat? Like the phantasm menace?
I mean, that's terrible, and don't bring up Star Wars again. I want to ban you from the server. Jack. Under my skin every time. Got to bring up the Star Wars. I'll go ahead and kick us off, though. I think I've got something going here in theory, and we'll see what we can get going. But with that, I will say hello and thank all of you. Jack, do you want to do the announcement real quick for me? That'd be lovely. Hello and thank all of you for joining us today at the Deleuze and Guattari's Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. Today we are moving into Series 31, the series of thoughts. We've been spending the last few weeks, we took last week off, but the last few bits have been sort of layering and layering and layering. We were going to jump into this last week, but to be perfectly honest, Logic of Sense is starting to become very difficult for me to grasp. So the goal here, as far as I'm concerned, anyone can sort of jump in if you want. The goal here at a basic level is to read every paragraph and break it apart, because I think we're having to start doing that now. This is going to be a more difficult one. There's a lot here and a lot to discuss, and I'm excited to do it. Any notes, anything that people want to bring up before I dive in and start reading away at Logic of Sense? Okay, I'm sharing PDF up, and we will get underway. The extreme mobility of the phantasm and its capacity for passage have often been stressed. It is a little like the Epicurean envelopes and emanations which travel in the atmosphere with agility. Two fundamental traits are tied to this capacity. First, the phantasm covers the distance between psychic systems with ease, going from consciousness to the unconscious and vice versa, from the nocturnal to the diurnal dream, from the inner to the outer, and conversely, as if it itself belonged to a surface dominating and articulating both the unconscious and the conscious, or to a line connecting and arranging the inner and outer over two sides. Second, the phantasm returns easily to its own origin, and, as an originary phantasm, it integrates effortlessly the origin of the phantasm. That is a question, the origin of birth, of sexuality, of the difference of the sexes, or of death. This is because it is inseparable from a displacement, an unfolding, and a development within which it carries along its own origin. Our earlier problem, where does the phantasm begin, properly speaking, already implies another problem. Where does the phantasm go? In what direction does it carry its beginning? Nothing is finalized like the phantasm. Nothing finalizes itself to such an extent. Well, I mean, we open up. It's nice. We actually open up in a nice, simple way, which is good. The setup here is the discussion about the phantasm itself being this passage, this thing that can link the unconscious to consciousness, the inner, outer, back and front, all of these things. And it carries this originary element with it. This thing that it does, this first element. Any comments on the first bit here?
I think what you're saying is correct. So fundamentally, I think the characteristic of phantasm is that it's mobile. It's extremely mobile. It's got, well, as you said, sorry, I'm just repeating what I said at the beginning. It's got extreme mobility, and as you say, it's got this capacity to connect. So it connects these different what is called psychic systems, consciousness to the unconscious, etc. And then it also got this originary element tied into it that it seems to carry along with it. So what Deleuze ends his paragraph by basically saying, so he said, where does it, so previously in the previous series, he talked about three characteristics of the phantasm, and the second one was where he talks about the beginning, where the phantasm begins. Where does it begin, properly speaking? And there he said it begins in relation to the ego. Now he's asking, but he says that already implies another problem. Where does it go? What relation does it carry its beginning? So it has this, so it's mobile and it carries its beginning. But I'm slightly puzzled by this final sentence. Nothing is finalized by like the phantasm. I think finalized itself. So this notion of it finalizing itself. So that's something perhaps will become perhaps more apparent as we read on.
Yeah, it's gonna come out a little bit more in the next paragraph as he talks about sort of what the beginning means and what finalizing and again concretizing, as he's been talking about, kind of comes to play here. But it's a really, to me, the idea of the phantasm, the fantasy, the phantasm that's created, as we've been talking about, that again disconnected from the body, like it's such a fascinating concept. But the idea that it plays as it needs to between the unconscious and the conscious, taking its own origination, its own unfolding, its own sort of its own beginning. It brings it with it. It's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, and I think we need to think about it in terms of the subject of this series, in terms of thought. I think that's the key to the phantasm in terms of it's. I think essentially what's being said in this series is that this is the question that Deleuze asks and elsewhere is, how does thought begin? I think this is what this focus of this series is about. It's explicating how thinking begins.
Yeah, I would agree. The thinking about thinking beginning, which is about as up its own ass as philosophy gets, but that's okay. I kind of like it. Any thoughts or notes before I move to the next paragraph, where we're going to have to spend a lot of time going through little sections because of everything. All right. We attempted to determine the beginning of the phantasm as the narcissistic wound or the trace of castration. In fact, in conformity with the nature of the event, a result of the action appears at this point, which is quite different from the action itself. The Oedipal intention was to restore, to bring about, and to coordinate its own physical surfaces, but all of this was still located within the domain of images, with the narcissistic libido and the phallus as the surface projection. The result is to castrate the mother and to be castrated, to kill the father and to be killed, along with the transformation of the phallic line in the trace of castration and the corresponding dissipation of all the images, mother world, father god, ego phallus. But if we make the phantasm begin on the basis of such a result, it is clear that this result would require for its development a different surface from the corporeal surface, where images were developed according to their own law, partial zones with genital coordination. The result will develop on a second screen, and thus the beginning of the phantasm will find its sequence elsewhere. Trace of castration does not by itself, constitute or outline this elsewhere or this other surface. It concerns always the physical body of the surface, and seems to disqualify it to the advantage of the depths and heights that it itself had conjured up. Thus the beginning is truly in the void. It is suspended in the void. It is without. The paradoxical situation of the beginning here is that it is itself a result, and that it remains external to that which it causes to begin. This situation would afford no way out had not castration transformed the narcissistic libido into desexualized energy. This neutral or desexualized energy constitutes the second screen, the cerebral or metaphysical surface on which the phantasm is going to develop, begin anew, beginning which now accompanies it at each step, run to its own finality, represent pure events which are like one and the same, result of the second degree. Oh, there's a lot. There's a lot there. Let's talk about the phantasm. We go back a little bit. Sort of the origin of the phantasm. The second screen, I think, is worth actually discussing here as a concept, because it's where the phantasm is born, where it is sort of arises, and this secondary narcissism, I think, is what he's referring to. The phantasm arises with the ego of secondary narcissism, with the wound, neutralization, symbolization, sublimation, these elements. The event as expressed, that secondary screen. And so when he says, we attempt to determine the beginning of the phantasm as the narcissistic wound or the trace of castration, in fact, in conformity with the nature of the event, a result of the action appears at this point, which is different from the action itself. This is, fuck. I'm open. If anyone wants to jump in.
Yeah, I think he's going backwards, isn't he? He's kind of repeating the idea of the phantasm was introduced in relation to the kind of the notion of the Oedipus complex. So, so he says, and it's this idea that the phantasm begins with the ego. So he said, so at the surface, the narcissistic wound or the trace of castration. And in conformity to the nature of the event, so a result that actually appears at this point. So appears at, so it's talking about the notion of it being an event. And then he described. Then the next section is a description. As what, again, it's something we've come across before. So the Oedipal intention was to restore, to bring about, to coordinate. That was the kind of Oedipus complex, is to restore wounded mother and to kind of or bring back the absent father, if I remember rightly.
Mm-hmm.
And he said all of this still located within the domain of images. And I think what we need to take from that, understand by domain of images, is that essentially it's a projection.
Yes.
So it's still at this level of projection. So it's still at the level of images, which is at the surface, I would say, with the narcissistic libido and the phallus as a surface projection. And so he said, and again, he's reiterating this notion of the Oedipus. So the result of this, to castrate the mother and to be castrated, to kill the father and to be killed. This is the kind of the result of good intentions and not being rewarded. This is a result of those good intentions being rewarded. So he said the result is to castrate the mother and to be castrated, to kill the father and to be killed. So this is a description of the Oedipus, the outcome, the unexpected outcome of the Oedipus complex.
The result.
The result, along with the transformation of the fight line, the trace of castration, the corresponding dissipation of the images.
And the result itself develops on this second screen, and thus the beginning of the phantasm finds its sequence elsewhere. This result appears, this is,
He says that if we make the phantasm begin on the basis of such a result,
it doesn't work out, yeah.
it's clear that the result would require for it to develop a different surface from the corporeal surface. Because the corporeal surface where images were developed.
Mm-hmm.
So the result, so that, excuse me, the projections are on the corporeal, whereas the result, the outcome, sorry, the event, or whatever you want to call it, will develop on a second screen. And this is what he's already spoken about, the kind of notion of the metaphysical screen, which I would say is to do with thought. It's where thought is developed.
But it seems like there's a so basically the way that he's talking about it here, we have these images at the surface where it seems like this is where we would find the birth of the phantasm, but instead it's actually due to the way that these images play and these other elements, we actually have this sort of second surface that gets it conjured up and built. And the beginning for that is actually itself in the void. It is without, it is suspended in here. And this ultimately is a bit of a paradoxical situation because now we have, pardon me, basically now we have the sort of birth at the same time as where the phantasm it would seem to end. Because there is this sort of desexualizing energy as he's talked about inside of all of this. It's interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, he's returning to that to series 29 when he introduced this notion of the two screens, and the kind of just trying to find the reference. So the metaphysical screen and the other one. This is probably the corporeal, I would guess. Corporeal surface. So the result will develop on a second screen. That's the beginning of the phantasm. We'll find its sequence elsewhere. I think this is where he's talking about the sequence. I would imagine. I imagine is another way of saying where does the phantasm go, what direction. So that's the end. At the end of the first paragraph, he asks that question. It's a question he wants to find out. The question he's now addressing is where does the phantasm go? That's what I feel reference to the sequence is referring to.
Feels like it. I would agree with that. That's interesting. Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah. So, because it's, yeah, okay. Normatic subject asks, stupid question. No such thing here. All of this stuff is stupid. What gets castrated in particular? I would say that we're talking in that sense. To me, it's a discussion about the subject, whatever we may want to call that there is a generalized castration. He talks about that a little bit earlier in his version of that, where we talk about Oedipus and he introduces it, where good intentions are inevitably punished. There's an entire section sort of about castration as its own sort of setup. That castration produces resistance and anxiety and guilt, withdrawal for the superego that condemns the libidinal desires, this castration that happens. And Oedipus sees this wounded body as a castrated body. And because of this lack that's generated. There's a lot of other, Melanie Klein, there's some Lacan in here. This is like classic sort of psychoanalytic sort of thinking. And so the child goes through the process of castrating the mother, as he said just right here, and ultimately betraying the father. And this sort of setup, this image, this phallus as an image across these surfaces turns into the line of castration and dissipation of the phallus itself. Now he describes it a little bit differently here because that's a little bit earlier. But as he's describing it here, which is great, the result of the domain of images being set there with the narcissistic libido and phallus as surface projection, the result is to castrate the mother and to be castrated, kill the father and to be killed, along with the transformation of the phallic line and the trace of castration and corresponding dissipation of all images. I read all this as that we're talking about essentially the subject and the overall sort of symbolic order of things. which I don't know if that applies as much here, but it feels like that's the direction. Anyone else want to answer? Please feel free.
I think that he's moving away. I think the phantasm is something that is not really tied. It has got this endless kind of mobility to it. In a sense, it can't be tied down. It has this character of carrying its own beginning, as he said, carrying its own origin, its own beginning with it. Where, and the other idea is, he's asking, well, where does it go? So I think he's looking at it, and I think he's looking at the other, screen. He has this image of screens, of two screens. One is the cerebral or metaphysical, like also metaphysical or cerebral screen. I think the other screen, I can't find the other one, but I think it's probably something to do with the corporeal, but I'm not sure about that. But I think he's developing it in relation to this metaphysical or cerebral screen, which is a screen which is essentially to do with thought, to do with thinking. So they said this neutral or desexualized energy constitutes second screen. The cerebral or metaphysical surface on which the phantasm is going to develop, begin anew with the beginning, which now comes at each step. In its own finality, represent pure events which are like one the same result of the second degree. So he's going, this is I think a different path he's going down, the path that was opened up by the kind of Oedipal. It's obviously related to, because we're still in the same kind of field of the relationship between the child and the parents. I still think that's operative within this. So it's still, that's why, it's still within that kind of psychological kind of milieu that he's been in the last few series. The question is to do with the phantasm. I think the phantasm is this strange thing that seems to circulate within throughout this. It seems to have no real home to it. And he's trying to kind of really understand where it comes from. And I think he's relating it to this cerebral metaphysical surface and essentially to thought. This is what he was saying. I think it was the last series he talks about speculation. He talks about speculation in relation to the phantasm. Kind of already kind of said it. Speculation, again, is this notion of thinking.
Like that. I hope overall that helped.
Will you carry on?
Yep, I will continue on.
Okay.
There is thus a leap. The trace of castration as a deadly furrow becomes this crack of thought, which marks the powerlessness to think, but also the line and the point from which thought invests its new surface. And precisely because castration is somehow between two surfaces, it does not submit to this transmutation without carrying along its share of opportunants, without folding in a certain manner and projecting the entire corporeal surface of sexuality over the metaphysical surface of thought. The phantasm's formula is this: from the sexual pair to thought via castration. If it is true that the thinker of depths is a bachelor, and that the depressive thinker dreams of lost betrothals, the thinker of surfaces is married or thinks about the problem of the couple. No one better than Klosowski has been able to disentangle this slow advance, the cheminement, of the phantasm, for it is the process of his entire work. In words which are seemingly odd, Klosowski says that his problem is that of knowing how a couple may project itself, independently of children, the way we could go from the couple to the thought constructed in the mode of the couple, in a mental comedy, or from sexual difference to the difference of intensity constitutive of thought. The primary intensity, which marks the 0 point of thought's energy, but also from which thought invests its new surface. His problem is always to extract, by means of castration, thought from a couple in order to bring about, through this crack, a sort of coupling of thought. Klossowski's couple, Roberta Octave, have in a certain respect their correspondence in Lowry's couple, and also in Fitzgerald's ultimate couple of schizophrenia and alcoholism. For not only is the entirety of the sexual surface, part and whole, involved in projecting itself over the metaphysical surface of thought, but depth and its objects or height and its phenomena as well. The phantasm returns to its beginning, which remained external to it. But to the extent that beginning itself was a result, the phantasm also returns to that from which the beginning had resulted, the sexuality of corporeal surfaces. And finally, little by little, it returns to the absolute origin from which everything proceeds, the depths. One could now say that everything, sexuality, orality, anality, receives a new form on the new surface, which recovers and integrates not only images, but even idols and simulacra. Again, playing with this trace of castration here as we follow it. Derek,
I take back what I said. I take back what I said earlier.
Yeah,
it's worth reading this in some detail. Because there is, so it begins by saying there is a leap. There's a leap. I mean, this is a phrase, a word I don't know about you guys, but I always associate with Heidegger because it's a term he uses quite a lot. But there's always something leapt over, in a leap. There's always something leapt over to return to something. He says that, so he brings the trace of castration as a deadly furrow. So that if we again have to think back to castration was at the surface, and it was the kind of phallic line that was traced by the ego on the surface. But now it's cracked open, so it's a line that is cracked open, and again it's this thing, this idea of the crack is something that we've seen previously before. It becomes this crack of thought which marks the powerlessness to think, also the line and point from which thought invests its new surface. So on one hand it's got this peculiar thing, it marks a powerlessness to think. So the trace of castration cracks this open, becomes a crack of thought. But also the line and point from which thought invests its new surface. And this new surface, as we've seen in the previous paragraph, is this kind of cerebral surface.
Metaphysical surface on which the phantasm will develop, begin anew, with a beginning which now accompanies it at each step, run to its own finality, representing pure events which are like one and the same result of the second degree. That's the play towards couples here, as he mentions. I'm not familiar exceptionally with Klossowski, but I do recognize Fitzgerald's couples of schizophrenia and alcoholism, and I get that representation. I get that reference for sure. The playing at it is interesting. So we're basically talking about this leap that happens, this crack that basically introduces powerlessness in terms of like originating new thought. It's a point of itself being effectively castrated between these two surfaces. Because castration is somehow between two surfaces, it does not submit to this transmutation without carrying along its share, without folding in a certain manner and projecting the entire surface of sexuality over the metaphysical surface of thought. That's really odd.
I think what's key is that the surface, so the castration has this. It's between these two surfaces. So the surfaces are the kind of. I've just kind of found the reference to sexual. On one hand, is a sexual and physical surface, and on the other hand, is a cerebral or metaphysical surface. So, this is what the kind of line of castration does. It's between these two things. It allows the corporeal surface of sexuality projected over the metaphysical surface of thought. So it's connecting this kind of this kind of the implication of the sexuality onto the metaphysical surface of thought. It's kind of bringing the two together. And he then goes on. He says in the next sentence, the phantasm's formula is this: the sexual pair to thought via castration. So you're given this kind of formula, so the sexual pair, and the sexual pairs that are given towards the later on in this paragraph in terms of Klosowski's couple, Lowry and Fitzgerald. So through sexual pair, again, we're still, it's how is thought, how does thinking begin? So it goes from this sexual pair to thought, but via this kind of castration, which has this, projects the corporeal surface over the metaphysical surface. So it's these two very different things are kind of brought together by this, through this idea of castration.
Well, and it's interesting, the very specific phrasing. If it's true, the thinker of depths is a bachelor, because we're now about to talk about couples, the way that couples project themselves, or how we deal with the coupling of things. The one of depths is a bachelor, which is, I won't be married to anything, I'm assuming is kind of the intention. I'm forever alone kind of thing. He's an incel. And then the thinker of the depressive, who's sort of stuck in the sky, the dreaming of lost betrothals. Oh, my loves, how it could have been, or how it was, and dealing with sort of that sort of stuck backwards in time. The thinker of the surface is married or thinks about the problem of the couple, the sort of the nature of how these things sort of come together, and the way that sort of thought can be generated from this. And he goes from there. It feels like Klosowski, he's very much referencing here, talking about how the couple, I think he's saying Klosowski's a thinker of the surface, but it's a very specific play towards this idea of, oh yeah, no, you can do X, Y, and Z, think about these things from sexual difference to the difference of intensity constitutive of thought, the primary intensity, which marks the 0 point, but also from which thought invests its new surface, because the new surface is connected to all of this and sort of generated. We now have this new thing that lays across all of it as sort of this sexual layer, the sexual surface that gets added. Is that what he's describing there?
I'd like to mention something.
Please.
The thinker of depths is a bachelor. I think that's a reference to Nietzsche. And the depressive thinker dreams of lost betrothals. That's Kierkegaard. And then he says the thinker of surfaces is married. Okay, so in Kierkegaard, either or, there's this character, Judge William, and he's the ethicist, as opposed to being an aesthete. And if you look at Stages on Life's Way, there is a, Kierkegaard has produced a kind of simulation of the Symposium of Plato, but the speeches are mostly by aesthetes, but also one by Judge William, and so in that, at the end, there's this scene where the aesthetes go off on a carriage ride, and the aesthetes are assumed to be like bachelors, and they go off on a carriage ride, and they go to the house of Judge William, and they hide behind the hedge and watch Judge William have tea in the garden with his wife, and so Judge William is the only one married, and And then one of them goes into the study of Judge William and steals a book. And so there's this very interesting scene because, Kierkegaard has all these characters in his books, but mostly they are aesthetes and in argument with Judge William about ethics and religion. And but in Stages on Life's Way, it's the first time he brings them all together and has each one of his characters speak at this symposium. So anyway, there's this very interesting scene in Kierkegaard, which I think we could see beyond this text, where you have the bachelors and the married ethicist who's basically defending marriage. And what Kierkegaard and Nietzsche have in common is that they're both bachelors.
So for me, it's really, I don't know enough. I love all of that. To me, it's the comment about bachelor, the comment about lost betrothals, and then the third about married. It's playing with one as being avoiding the sort of singular, avoiding the singular terms, the other being about sort of moving away from dualisms, and the third being about looking at sort of, I don't want to say splitting the difference, but that, I mean, works almost too well, because we're talking about the cracks between things, the cracks in the surface, the problem of the couple into which things may fall or we may fall. That's the thinker of the surface's job, effectively, as he's saying it here. And again, the thinker of the surface is what he's kind of pushing us all to kind of be. That feels like at least there's an impetus there.
And another thing is that we can see here kind of like the justification for Deleuze's collaboration with Guattari, and the idea that two can think better than one. And, there's a biography of Guattari and Deleuze together called Intersecting Lives, where you can kind of see what their collaboration was like. But it's just kind of interesting that it's a joint biography of them as a couple thinking together.
Jack, anyone else? There's a lot said here, and before we continue moving, because there's a lot still to be said.
Yeah, so I guess we could continue with this paragraph. So yeah, it comes to this. It kind of focused on Klosowski. So he says no one better than Klosowski has been able to disentangle this slow advance of the phantasm. So it's the kind of theme. It seems to be the theme of his entire work. He says again, how a couple may project itself independently of children. So the way we could go from the couple to the thought construct. So again, it's this bringing this idea of thinking within it. It's thought in the mode of the couple in a mental comedy, or from sexual difference to the difference of intensity constituted thought. So again, it's the kind of idea of thought is central to this this narrative. And it's also the prime intensity which marks the 0 point thought's energy, but also from which thought invests its new surface. So how, again, this is the question is, I would say it's fundamentally going back to the first paragraph. So, in what direction does it go? How does it begin? But where does it go? And I think tied to that is this notion of thinking. How does thinking begin? I think he's given this example here of the kind of couple through which thought comes about, through thinking comes about. But he says his problem is always to extract by means of castration thought from a couple. So we go back to this notion of he gives that from sexual pair. So to this sexual pair to thought via castration. So the sexual pair to generate thought, of a thinking that might be, or just do it through castration. It's also extract by means of castration thought from a couple. So that formula is he's putting within the work of Klosowski.
Very specifically, just because it's worth mentioning, Robert and Octave are the two characters in his book, and I'm not going to even anglicize it, The Revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Octave is a cleric, and he has a young wife, Roberta, who's beautiful and very sexual, and it's about the sort of spiritual and sexual coming together and where they have issues. So it's specifically, it is talking about, again, that the crack between the two and the space between the two.
And it's essentially that it's projected onto this what he calls this metaphysical surface, which is the surface of, well, he says it there. He says, so not only the entirety of the sexual surface, the parts and nodes involved in project itself over the metaphysical surface of thought. So it's this section of it starts from this kind of the sexual surface that's where it begins from, but it's then connected to the metaphysical surface of thought. So it's different from the kind of the other surface, which is the sexual physical surface. This is, like I said, this theory is about thought, and essentially how does thought happen or take place or begin. So it's not only over the sex, but he's developing this further, but he says it's not only over the metaphysical surface of thought, but depth and its objects, or height and its phenomena as well. So it's also in the depth and in the height. And the last bit, he just, essentially, I think he kind of describes the phantasm. It kind of answers his question beginning in paragraph 1. Where does phantasm go? So how does it begin and where does it go? He says it returns to its beginning. And so the phantasm returns to its beginning, which remained external to it, which is castration. So that again, it's that sexual physical surface of castration, but to the extent that beginning itself was a result. Again, this is kind of repeating what he's already said in a way. So the beginning itself was a result, so it's a kind of outcome of an event. So it returns to that from which the beginning had resulted.
The sexuality of the corporeal surfaces itself.
So this is that other surface. So at this point, what happens? I think this is perhaps why the phantasm is so mobile. It's not only does it give rise to thought, but it also is able to connect the other surface, in the corporeal surface.
Well, we're talking about with specifically the sexual, because we are talking about that's its own surface that kind of gets laid on top. If we go back to the 28th series, that's a big point for him, kind of across all that, is that these partial surfaces get developed. There's a sexuality that links surfaces itself, and so they become kind of its own thing on top of all of that. So when he's referring here to the sexual surfaces, sexuality of corporeal surfaces, we're talking back about series 28 again, and calling back to that.
So I think the phantasm seems to have this capacity to kind of incorporate everything. So the phantasm returns to that from which the beginning had resulted, so the corporeal surface. And finally, little by little, it returns to the absolute origin from which everything proceeds, which is the depth. One could now say that everything, sexuality, orality, anality, receives a new form and this none the new surface. Recovers and integrates not only images, but even idols and simulacra. So again, if you remember, images are what's projected at the surface. The idols are at the height, and the simulacra are of the depth. So it's the whole kind of orientation, the whole kind of structure of surface, depth, and heights is the phantasm is related to.
Yeah. Well, it's for not only is the
if I could just add a couple things
sure
or comment on a few things, some of which are questions and some of which are interpretations. In listening to the last interpretation, it seems that we can bring it back to some of the Freudian language where this return to the sexual corporeal surface it kind of reminds me of the possibility of the repetition compulsion cycle, and it's returning back to things that are unresolved, that are in the unconscious, and that get played out and enacted, hoping to get resolved on the one hand sexually, but then I want to also tie this to the move into the surface of the metaphysical and the surface of the couple, right? So it's very interesting because I was thinking that the crack in the couple is I'm wondering whether that it's a little bit more neutral than the crack that happens within like the bachelor or the individual, that it's kind of taken on a new shape, and that in fact the phantasm, according to this reading, sort of begins to also transform itself as it moves into trying to instantiate itself in the couple. So there's a difference between the phantasm for the bachelor and the couple, and that this crack for the couple is, and here I'm being influenced a little bit by a recent reading in the Simone Don group. The crack develops, and I'm thinking there's a formulation or an application here where you think about how the couple has to negotiate or establish separate lives to a certain extent, and then they come back together, and so this phantasm develops through the interplay, possibly, of their lives apart as a couple, and when they're together, because in this last few paragraphs of the recent passage, we can almost imagine how all this gets activated, the phantasm, the tension or the movement to and fro from the metaphysical level, and how the sexual plane as well, the sexual corporeal, finds its way into the manifold. So there's an interplay between this metaphysical level and the sexual corporeal for the couple that's that has tensors in between them. I'm inserting another term, but my question is, though, I have difficulty understanding what could be evidence of the metaphysical other than it being taken literally metaphysical, in the sense of focusing a little bit on the gravitas of the physical aspect between the couple, a kind of a difference of the metaphysical rather than a metaphysics, but a rather the physiological that gets activated for the couple. So that's a little bit of an extension of my interpretation. But I kind of was thinking that, is it really metaphysical or is it meta-ethical? I was kind of questioning whether the level of the interplay between the couple, the heterogeneous couple was the one I was using as the case in mind. Wondering whether, the tension that's created there with the penetration of the sexual surface moving through the language that's between the couple, and then there's a kind of trying to I think on the part of the couple to move beyond that, but then there's the actual physical return to the earlier phantasm at some point through the sexual and the intimacy. But I guess my question is, could it be more meta-ethical that's being exchanged on the level of thought for the couple?
I think Deleuze is developing this in a structural way. So the structure is that he's already spoken about the metaphysical surface. He's already said how that functions and the relationship between. He said there's two surfaces set up. One is the corporeal, one is the metaphysical, and so this is the structure within which he's working. But the other thing I think, in relation to what you say about the couple, what you kind of left out of that description is the role of the author. So Klosowski, the couples act through the author, makes them in a way act. These are kind of fictional figures in this sense. This is why they're applicable to kind of service of thought. So what he said that Klosowski does is his problem. That Klosowski's problem is of knowing how a couple may project itself independent of children, and then he goes on from there. But I think it's essentially it's a kind of process of thinking through the authors. So Klosowski, he names the three authors: Klosowski, Lowry, and Fitzgerald. And the previous notion of the crack was in terms of Fitzgerald and Lowry, actually, when I think about it. So I think this element, it's like I say, I think it's fundamentally within the structure that Deleuze sets up, but it's also in relation to thinking, in relation to this, to the kind of authorial voice, the author, the kind of way in which this is brought about is through the agency of someone like Klosowski, and
he's exploring the. I understand what you're saying. He's exploring the works and the cases that are developed by these authors, in a way, the enactments that happen that these authors create, and he's exploring them as opposed to seeing them as instances of capturing life. So he's kind of taking the route through the art as opposed to a comparative approach.
he's not a psychiatrist.
No, I know, but what I'm saying is he's using the vehicle of what the literary vehicle, and exploring that as opposed to reinforcing the his psychoanalytic position with the examples of Klosowski or the example from the art.
No, what I would say is fundamentally, I mean, they're not examples in a sense. They're not like, I think the narrative throughout has been to do with language, how language, for example, the phantasm comes through language. He says one of its characteristics is expressed in grammar. It has a grammatical expression. And so I think the idea is that it's implicit. It's within their writing. It's not like an example. It's not. It's the whole logic of sense is fundamentally to do with language. I would say the way language expresses sense. That's essentially one of its primary uh, foundations. So
Yeah, that's
this
fine,
is
and I realize that that is a position that you're um, grounding things on, but there's a lot at work in these different layers of the use of language, um, as he shows that there's interacting dimensions of human behavior that's affected on the intrapsychic level. Obviously, there's tons of psychoanalysis going on here, so in his text, so there's a lot of things that are being mixed together. But I think I understand your point, and it's a bit of a tangent and sort of discussion in the margins. But my point initially was that so I was thinking about the case of the couple, and it seems like Klosowski has a particular symptomatic case of behavior and enactment for a couple, rather than a possible analysis or interpretation of what may be going on for the couple at the metaphysical level. So it's rather looking at it from two different perspectives. One is a localized perspective that I think Klosowski has, and the other one is more of a global domain. Yeah, that's very good, actually. Thanks for that. I think it's in support of the idea that there's, I think that when bachelors move towards the coupling and the commitments that are there, there's a lot that's in the process. Oftentimes with like fusion of ideas that may be happening under the sort of the eros of the sexual corporeal plane. And then later, once that merging happens, then there's the movement. And again, I like the idea of maybe a topological expression of it, or or idea of trying to understand it from that perspective, of moving again away in tension to and from that that union.
Yeah, I'll just say something brief. So as I read it, the point about the services, I take it as like in a sense, there's a development of relations going on, right? And this is like that set going back to, I think, series sets, where he sets up signifiers and signifies, this idea of two sets, development of a relationship between the two, right? And so as I read this, this point about castration and the development of these two surfaces, if you like, these two strings in that, seems to be another development of this this conceptuality, one that the phantasm seems to be used to explain and develop, right? Because when I read leap, I do think of Kierkegaard, like Kent may have been suggesting, because I think of the teleological suspension, right? The leap of faith, where maybe intentionality is being kind of foregone, but more so like the ends of things is certainly being foregone. One is doing without that kind of expectation and that. And so when I see this point about the phantasm, the formula being from the sexual pair to thought via castration, maybe that's not exactly a teleological point, but there does seem to be something going on here in terms of, with castration, right? We have seen how intentionality is kind of facing its own inversion, right? It's its own downfall, right? So it's typical kind of hubris there. The best of intentions are the worst rewarded, right? Um, sorry about that. So it does make me think of Kierkegaard there. And if we walk over to this point about the bachelor and the depressive and the couple, um, I go back to I think I have it bookmarked. It's the 18th series of the three images where he goes through those three, and I'll just try and top line it real quick. But the thinker of the depths, right? So this is like Deleuze will say it's Nietzsche. I think of Heraclitus though, the aphoristic guy who's trying to always go deeper into things, kind of. And this point about objects that he'll tie it to later, right? So there's this point about corporeality, but particularly things, right? The things in the surface that can be brought out later. And still kind of this point about Chronos, whereas the depressive thinker in Los Betrothos makes me think of, right, the Platonic, going upward and downward with this manic excitement at the same time as also its own descending, right? But there's still this point about going up and down upon the surface or going kind of beneath it to what's underneath. Phenomena being tied to what's up above, right? But this point about the couple is really interesting because it seems to illustrate the point about where sexual difference, right, which kind of sounds like corporeality, is actually going to be, right, there's this kind of this thing about desexualization and that energy, which passes into the mode of the couple, right? And when I read that, I think Deleuze is trying to say that with castration, right, with intentionality going through this kind of this sort of defeat, if you like, but this more so inversion, that kind of castrating inversion actually produces thought, and that production of thought is to go from sexualized difference, which I think of in terms of like mixture, or even that upward and downward kind of spiral, and now becoming not so much in that kind of sexuality, but here becoming intensive difference. And that seems to be the 0 point, right? Where thought, or rather the phantasm, is moving from this plane of the depth of objects and the heights of phenomena into the perversion of it all at a metaphysical level, which is going to be the 0 point, the origin, right? The origin of thought that's the phantasm is going to move back and forth between.
That's a good question. What does it mean? Yeah, I think if we just go through it again, just carefully go through it. So he says, what does it mean to recover and to integrate? That's the question he's asking. Then he says what he means. He says what he means, but well, he means by sublimation. Trying to think. So the relationship between what does it mean to recover and integrate? So as you did, Brooks, go back to the previous sentence, the end of the previous paragraph. That everything, sexuality, orality, anality, receives a new form on the new surface. So this, which recovers and integrates. So it recovers not only images but even idols. So what's projected, the idols of the height and the simulacra of the depth are brought together. So what does it mean to recover and to integrate? So then he goes on to sublimation symbolization. So I'm not quite sure why that happened, but if we read it, perhaps we'll find out. Then he says sublimation is what he's already been through these two things. So sublimation is that trace. So in which the trace of castration becomes a line of thought. I think the notion of sublimation is that through which thought comes about, and the notion of symbolization is the way in which thought. What does thought do? It invests things with this process. So the thought and its relation to things is this process of symbolization. So he says we gave the name symbolization to the operation through which thought reinvests with its own energy all that occurs and is projected over the surface.
So is he framing this in the in terms of Freudian notions of the pleasure and the reality principle, and also in Lacanian language, which is sublimation as a form of expression of the sexual drives and conflicts, within the unconscious, and integrating them in symbols, in the symbolic order, through socially accepted, behaviors and adaptations and so forth, or through art, and that the phantasm. I'm not sure if I'm interpreting this correctly, but to me it seems like it's a kind of the expression of the pleasure principle that operates throughout a person's life from the beginning, and expresses it in literature, in literature that is that creates fantasies and stories and so forth. But it also tries to deal with confronts the reality principles of castration and the death drive, and tries to incorporate that, and maybe the thought is an expression of that. Thought is a kind of a way of a sublimation through through the metaphysics of the leap, perhaps, and that's another form of sublimation. Yeah.
I think what's been said in this first section is the relationship is how it's a kind of a process. It's a kind of the process through which we start with sublimation, then to thought, how they relate to each other, so it's not a question. So one doesn't cause the other. So it's not a question of causality, but rather geography and topology. This doesn't mean that thought thinks about sexuality, and not thinker thinks about marriage. So he's connecting this to the thinker, the person who thinks, which in the previous paragraph was the authors like Klostowski and Fitzgerald. This thought, which is the metamorphosis of sex and the thinker. So it brings a thought and goes back and brings its metamorphosis, sex and the thinker. Sorry, it's thought which is a metamorphosis of sex. The thinker is a metamorphosis of the couple, from the couple to thought. So this is again what he was saying earlier. So again, it's this notion of the couple from the thought through castration. The thought reinvests the couple as a dad in coupling. Again, he's repeated what he said earlier, from castration to thought. From the couple to thought. Sorry, yeah, he's kind of developing this idea. So anyway, sorry, yeah.
Could I mention that it says it's been quite a while since there's been anything comical in supposing the relationship between wound of castration and the crack of constitutive thought, or between sexuality and thought as such. That reminds me of Aristophanes and the clouds, and how Aristophanes makes fun of Socrates, and of course Aristophanes is full of kind of ribald humor. But what's so fascinating is that Plato puts Aristophanes in the Symposium with the highest speech, beyond which there's only what Socrates got from Diatoma. And what's interesting is that Aristophanes retells a story about the creation of human beings, where essentially human beings were glued together by their backs, and that they got cut apart, and then they're constantly searching for their partner, and their partner may be either male or female. And so it's kind of like a genesis of homosexuality, and that's in this myth. And so, but you notice that if the couple is glued together back to back, then there's going to be a split that's going to have to happen to produce the human beings that are separate, which is like a crack. And so it's just kind of interesting that saying it's been a long time since we've had this kind of humor that relates sexuality and thought, kind of brings to mind Aristophanes and his relationship to Socrates, because his play was one of the probably one of the major things that kind of led to Socrates' death, because he basically made Socrates into a sophist.
Towards the end of the section, you've said, Brooks. Then he says, to be precise, the phantasm goes from the figurative to the abstract. It begins the figurative, must be continued in the abstract. I mean, I would take the abstract as being this metaphysical surface of thought, and the figurative is the corporeal. The phantasm, so again, it's a descriptive. So the phantasm is a process of the constitution of the incorporeal. I think this is what it's going towards. It's like how is the incorporeal constituted? So and the phantasm. So he's saying the phantasm is a process of the constitution incorporeal. It's a machine for the extraction of a little thought. Distribution of a difference of potential at the edge of the crack for the polarization of the cerebral field. As it returns to its external beginning, it is always beginning again. It's an internal beginning. I mean, I think it's useful at this point to think, what is a phantasm? Again, it's something that I think we've really touched upon, because we keep using this term, but we don't actually kind of acknowledge what a phantasm is. Or I think it's useful to give an example of a phantasm. Well, the Deleuze himself gives two examples of a phantasm. And the first one is a child is being beaten. It is a phantasm. And these words bring about the phantasm. The other one, I think, is the father is seducing his daughter, something like that. I can't quite remember. So it starts from the figurative. So if you look at that phrase, the child is being beaten, it has that figurative element to it. It's actual. You can sort of think it as an event, not in that sense, but as something taking place. But its structure is being beaten. A child. It has that other element to it in terms of its kind of having inconclusive structure, I would say. And this is why I think it goes from the figurative to the abstract. It always gives off these other things. This is why it's forever mobile. It can't be pinned down. It has its own, this really mobile, and it has its own kind of beginning contained within it. It's also to do with why it's grammatical. It's contained within that structure, those words, that when they're brought together.
The polarization of the cerebral field, that reminds me of, how the bicameral brain, and how there's the two hemispheres of the brain and the kind of crack down the middle. And interestingly enough, the neurons that are used for thinking are on the surface of that brain. And then there's this chiasmic effect where the left hand is related to the right brain, and the right hand to the left brain. So it's kind of interesting to think about that kind of chiasm in relationship to the structure of the brain, and the brain is bicameral. So there's a coupling within the brain as well.
So, I mean, if we go on to the next section, so it says the phantasm is the property of bringing. So it has this property of bringing into contact these two sides. And talks about the inner and the outer, and uniting them on a single side. And again, this is familiar from he's talking maybe a strip, how two sides can become united in a single side. So this is why it is a site of the eternal return. And he said, and I would kind of relate that to the following sentence. He said it mimics endlessly the birth of a thought into new desexualization, sublimation, and symbolization. So sublimation is the thing through which thought is brought about, and symbolization when thought acts upon things, caught in the act of bringing about the birth. Then he goes on, without this intrinsic repetition of beginning, the phantasm cannot integrate its own extrinsic beginning. Then he's now, in the next section, I think he's talking about a phantasm function in a way. So he said the risk is obviously that phantasm falls back on the poorest thought, a pure or redundant diurnal reverie about sexuality. This is its mark and falls short. So is a path of phantasm, path of glory, is that which is indicated by Proust from the question, shall I marry Albertine? And this is something he said, I think, earlier, or it might be to come. I can't remember, I've read this somewhere, but the notion that one of the characteristics of the phantasm, it's to do with questions, asking questions about birth, about death, well, not death, but he says marriage, etc. And I think I think I'm not 100% that question, shall I marry Albertine, may have a form of a phantasm, but I don't want to say that 100%. I'm not 100% sure about that. To the problem of the work of art yet to be made. So this is the path of enacting speculative coupling, beginning with a sexual pair. So again, what he's saying here, I think, is that the phantasm leads to the creation of a work of art. So, it doesn't have it's not a kind of descriptive, it's not a propositional sentence that describes a state of affairs. It has this strange kind of capacity to bring it to kind of to bring out this metamorphosis, this process in which the work of art is created. This is why I think that he talks about people like Klosowski, Lowry, Fitzgerald, and now Proust.
Another example might be James Joyce Ulysses, where the main character is out walking around in the city to avoid being at home, where his wife is having an affair with someone else. And so there's this juxtaposition between the thoughts of the main character as he's walking around the city and the constant background of the infidelity of his wife at home.
Yeah. So then he asks, what kind of metamorphosis is it when thought invests, which is projected over its surface with its own desexualized energy? Then the answer is that thought does it in the guise of the event. Kind of again returning to this notion of the event. And he said it's non-actualizable. So it's not this. Say I would relate that kind of non-actualizable to the figurative aspect. It's not that. It is again more to do with the metaphysical surface that he's talking about.
And I think one of the things here is the idea that thought is kind of like an emergent event within consciousness. And so, of course, if you have an emergent event, its characteristics are completely different from the base upon which it or from which it arises. And so that's kind of the leap, going from the kind of substantial base in bodies with consciousness that are alive to this other surface where you have this emergent property of thought within language.
That's part of the reason I would push back a little bit on that thought being only consciousness, right? Because the phantasm goes in between consciousness and unconsciousness. I I think there might be something here going on, like where he's talking about, for instance, there arise the aggressions and veracities which transcend what was happening in the depths of bodies, desires, loves, pairings, copulations, and intentions which transcend everything happening at the surface of bodies, and finally powerlessness and deaths which transcend all that could have happened. This is the incorporeal splendor of the event as that entity which addresses itself to thought and which alone may invest an extra being. So all these aspects of the event and these effects that are bound up there are investing thought, right? But at the same time, I think accepting that premise, I get the sense that thought does have. I mean, even this point about phantasm between unconscious and consciousness. I don't know if thought is purely conscious, right?
One of the
And I
things,
agree. I think because what he says is that, just going to that sentence, that section you just quoted. So there arises aggression and veracity. It transcends the depth of bodies, transcends the surface, well, but also transcends the heights as well.
Yeah.
So he calls this the incorporeal splendor of the event as the entity which addresses itself to thought, which alone may invest it extra being. So he's kind of going on to this extra being, this thing outside of being, thing,
But
which again is something we've come across previously.
so what extra being is that Mignon kind of used existence against being and kind of categorized the different kinds of ways that things can be, but there's all kinds of things that can be that don't exist, and so that's what the event is, the extra above existence within being.
if he's framing this in the Lacanian, terms, the unconscious, also has a language, that it uses. So you could say that the phantasm is a kind of maybe a pre-conscious, what he calls non-thetic consciousness, using this Sartre's term. So is that possible that it is a kind of symbolization process, or in the end, taking place from the unconscious as well as in the conscious, that the phantasm is working out of as the kind of the foundation for all these other things?
I think the extra being actually refers to Stoicism. It's something we had right at the beginning, and it's the aliquid. It's the something. I mean, there are examples from Lewis Carroll, the whatchamacallit, whatever. All these things. So the extra being is this other thing that kind of circulates beyond being, and again, it's just our aliquid or our liquid, the impassive extra being. Which I've just as a quote. I'm looking at page 7 of my copy. Passive extra being, Eustera, inefficacious, and on the surface of things, ideation or the incorporeal, no longer be anything other than an effect. So I think this is what he's referring to. He's connecting that to the extra being, the thing, the something, the it, extra being, the aliquid, I should say.
One of the things about the difference between sublimation and symbolization is that the idea that thought can be about anything other than sex, you can see whatever that is as a sublimation, of sexual energies that become then desexualized. But on the other hand, you get the symbolization where there is this expression of the sexuality in various symbols, say used in a work of art, for instance. I mean, I think this is kind of interesting because basically he's saying that thought itself is completely bound up in sexuality, even when it pretends that it's not, and that we can always read thought back into like say Freud does, read thought back into the sexual basis. And the thing is that as we read Anti-Oedipus, we always had this question about what this falling back means. And I think here we have an excellent example of that falling back. In other words, no matter how exalted your thoughts are, they could always be seen to fall back into sexuality as a basis. I just like to mention something real quick, which is that Nietzsche met Lou Salome, and evidently he asked her to marry him, but she didn't, because he thought that he had found his match in her as someone who thought as deeply as he did. And it's very interesting that in the unpublished fragments from the period of Zarathustra, which is in volume 14, it begins with some things that are addressed to Lou Salome, and they are about the nature of woman. And it looks like he was thinking about writing a book on women. And so here's a really interesting example of exactly what we're thinking about, is that Nietzsche kind of, when he met his match and he wanted to marry her, I mean, what his thoughts turned to was the nature of women, and so you can kind of see there an example of this relationship of thought to sexuality.
But I
And
like that you bring that up too, because you have that right. So you've got, like you're saying, there's this just there. I mean, I think there's a tension between the sexualization of the narrator and Albertine, right? Like you're the things they were doing on that, but also the question of marriage, right? Which is kind of a, shall I marry? It's kind of that. It sounds like a consideration, right? It almost sounds like we're talking about thought, but it seems like it's more that with that problematic there, right? Which I think we can put in terms of the Platonic, right? Marriage, um, and Albertine is kind of the something from the depths, if you like. just to kind of like try and top line it to the problem of the work of art yet to be made, right? Something at the something to be done in that, which is a different problem. I do like the and maybe you were suggesting it, but I do like to think more about that, where in the relationship of the narrator and Albertine, right, there is at the same time a relationship to a project that's to be written, and in between those two, there seems to be, um, and you can kind of read intentionality into that, right? Shall I marry him? What do I intend to do? Um, and what do I intend to write, perhaps? In between those two, it does seem to me that we could talk about the way in which an intentionality in his relationship with Albertine, in that, um, both through the use of sexual energy, right, the coupling, um, the perversion of it all, if you like, or at least what's going to become the perversion of it all. If that does go through this kind of castration of intentionality, that's going to produce this phantasm, and that it would be interesting to think about how this is going toward the textuality of that book to be written, right? Where um, one, and that does sound like Proust to me. One cannot help but think, right? It's not like the petrification per se, but it just the way that that book opens up. The guy is immersed in thought. Um, some strange ones at that. So maybe I don't have too much of a point here, but it's interesting to me that the desexualized energy would be thought and moving toward this in between, the work of art to be done, and that this question of what shall I do, right? What and perhaps even instead of not just what do I want, going toward what do I intend, and the way that that will be kind of lead to the third question of um, what am I thinking about, following those two steps.
I'd like to just mention real quick that we're reading Thus Spake Zarathustra, and one of the things you see in there that is that Nietzsche holds out the promise of the possibility of a thinking couple. And so, that was kind of like an ideal for Nietzsche, was the idea that there could be a thinking couple.
I
Yeah,
just want to
I will.
repeat what I said earlier, actually, about the phantasm. So I think this question, shall I marry Albertine, is the expression of I think it's essentially the beginning of a phantasm. If you go back to, I've just found the thing I was trying to find. So the first paragraph of this series, he says the origin of the phantasm is a question, and then on the origin of birth, of sexuality, or the difference of sexes, or of death. I think this question, the origin of is the phantasm, becomes a phantasm. It carries on into the problem of the work of art. I think that's what I would say. That's why it brings in Proust, because he says on one hand, the kind of phantasm could, as one hand, it could give rise to this poor thought, the poorest thought, rather redundant reverie. On the other hand, it can give rise to what he calls the phantasm's path of glory, which is essentially the creation of the work of art, which starts from, again, it's this notion of how do things begin. I think this what Proust does is a process of thinking. How does it begin? It begins with the expression of the phantasm. The expression is, shall I marry Albertine? That's the beginning. That's what sets it in motion, I would say.
Yeah, I think we're getting at the same thing there, right? With this question of marrying Albertine, right? You kind of have the corporeal, the passions, and obviously sexuality, sexualized. But again, there seems to be then that point about the intentionality of marrying Albertine, right? and this point about glory, insofar as it's concerned. Because it does seem like with this question of intentionality, right, like you're saying, why think? And more so, how does one find themselves thinking, right? Because here it's not like you're putting yourself into the mode of thinking per se, but once intentionality starts happening, it seems to produce those thoughts by taking the sexualized energy, this kind of, it's almost like we're thinking of the corporeal through the carnal right here, right? Without too much lewd suggestion. Hi, Brett. I'll let you go.
Okay, but can we think about or possibly acknowledge the castration that's at work? And again, we're brought back into the, however we refer to the symptomological essence that arises, or the symptomological object that doesn't get seen. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. With this notion of the fact that the thought cannot actually accomplish anything. All that is written there about all that happens in thought, and the idea that that supports that some sort of accomplishment is going to happen through that thinking process is problematic. So what I'm trying to say is that, again, we see at work the phantasm in this that, I don't know, maybe it's not the phantasm necessarily, but that symptom that's there for him, that comes with the lack of commitment that arises through fear, through the affect of, and the thought of needing to control exactly what happens when the action begins to unfold new thought. The very thought of accomplishment is to prevent any new thought from happening outside of the very generating process of those thoughts, the obsession about shall I marry Albertine, and working through the various permutations of that, or past, or without any recognition of affect that may be influencing his thinking, and having it spin time and time again, weaving it back upon itself like a palimpsest. Right, but it's all moving towards the thought of the singularity, right? It's the phantasm of the subject, as opposed to there's no knowing of the phantasm that is going to differentiate itself from the coupling.
I think the focus of this paragraph is going towards extra being, the last two words of this paragraph. Because he says that, so the thought is in terms of the event. He says it does it with the part of the event that we should call non-actualizable, and that is extra being. I think that's the focus of this. The end result, because then it connects into the next paragraph. I can't take a break, but to go quite soon, actually. Quite soon. Should we do this next bit next week, do you think, or not?
We're not gonna get this. We're not gonna get this shit. This shit is all part of the phantasm. There's no getting it. It just continues to just spread itself out, and it's like a body without organs. It just keeps going. There's no capturing it.
What? going.
Yeah, I mean, how much
What's
is
what's
left?
the alternative?
It
What's
should be
the, sorry,
that much.
what's the alternative? Oh, I see. Yeah. At the beginning of this paragraph, so he's extended the idea of what an event is. He says that we argue that it's possible, if it were possible to speak of the event, as if it were possible to speak of the event as soon as the result was distinguished from the actions and passions from which it resulted. from the bodies in which it was actualized. So this is the early idea. The event is kind of distinguished from the thing that brings it about, the bodies, the interaction of the bodies, mixture of bodies that brings it about. He's now saying that this is not accurate. He says we must wait for the second screen, the metaphysical surface. So that is on which, and I was going to say that which his thought is kind of comes about. Earlier, there have been only simulacral idols, images. So the height, the depth, and the surface. So these three things were the things through which events were represented, but not phantasms. He talks here about pure events. I think that it seems to me that this notion of the pure event is what's being connected to the phantasm. A pure event is, for example, is as he gives the example of the verb, its infinitive state. Again, it's something he's spoken about previously. So the verb to green or to eat become distinct from the thing so distinct from the tree, distinct or distinct from food, make distinct from bodies. These are the pure events, I would say. The verb becomes this pure event. Well, he goes on, he says, metamorphosis is the liberation of the non-existent entity. This is, again, the aliquid, the something. Short metaphor is the liberation of the non-existent entity for each state. So each state of affairs has this kind of non-being, extra being, I should say, of the affinity for each body and quality, each subject and predicate, each action passion. So metamorphosis is this sublimation symbolization, which we talked about right at the beginning of the previous paragraph. So this
So, am I on the right trace here? Following the right trajectory? Because when I start thinking about, the parts that you guys are referring or that you're talking about here, I'm not looking at the text currently, unfortunately. Is at the heart of going back to some of the earlier series as well, and talking about sense on the linguistic, i.e. semantic level, and seeing how the subject is affected by the for one, let's say one way of we could think of metaphors relating to metamorphosis as symbol is related to symbolization. So, and when a subject dislodges, kind of uproots the infinitive form of to green, and it no longer refers to like a tree, or it is now in reference to something else, particularly when the language is used in a relation to subject object or subject/subject relation, when someone is being spoken to or with. And so this opens up to a metaphysical surface. And I think what's happening is that in this particular paragraph, there is another set of terminology, which in a way is similar to a set of terminology that he used earlier with sense and referring to Frege. So, but he's developing it further, and what's happening is the metaphoric kind of there's no real there's an uprooting of the use of the original uses of these terms as we find them in like dictionary, and so there is a kind of losing my train of thought here, but basically there's a space or dimension which these terms are then used from, which open up people to a metaphysical plane, and then they have to deal with the meanings, the sense of these new uses of these terms, like to mate. You know, somebody could definitely use the word to mate like by saying joining with something else. You could mate two objects together, which is another dimensional use of the term away from its original use, and you know, could generate a whole different metaphysical plane for a subject slash subject or subject slash object relation. So I think that
I don't think it's. I think you're really off track here. I think what he's talking about. He's talking about the infinitive of the verb is associated from what it's usually associated with, and it becomes noetic, or it becomes this a liquid. And I think that's as simply as he said. And it's not a semantic. You use the word semantic. It's definitely not semantic. It's definitely not to do with semantics.
No,
sense,
what I'm pointing out is
in the
actually
kind of extra in the sense of the event, I would say.
Right, but the illiquid capacity of these words, I guess you summarized it well. The illiquid capacity of the use of these words, I think, is what he's referring to. He's kind of dislodging them from the normal use and seeing how that opens up to metaphysical planes. Where actually, as he describes, if you read that sentence where he describes the metaphysical plane, that's actually something that's happening right now between you and I, or even as a group, as people carry on the dialogue with these topics. He is accounting for that with the various introjections, projections, and the other things that he mentioned that happen on that metaphysical surface. Yeah, I don't know. For some reason, I think I am on point there. I am kind of along the same. I'm riding the surface of exactly what he's saying.
I think the phantasm seems to be being ignored in what you're saying. And it seems to be there's no reference being made to the phantasm. This is essentially what's being spoken about, and it's way in which it enables thought to come about. I think that's the kind of that's what's been looked at within this series, I would say.
Right. I definitely would agree with that, that he doesn't make mention of the phantasm, and that this part kind of is in disjunction with the phantasm. Yeah. But it does bring into question where the phantasm is in the subject once they enter onto the metaphysical surface.
I think I read this, the phantasm has its own kind of existence almost. It might be it's expressed. It comes about when it's expressed. So, for example, a child is being beaten. That's a kind of, Brooks indicates, a kind of Freudian phantasm. I would say that Iris Proust says, "Shall I marry Albertine?" is again in the form of the phantasm, because it's something that starts something off. It's a question. The origin of the phantasm. I'm just going back. I'm just going to quote: "The origin of the phantasm is a question. The origin of birth, sexuality, difference of sexes, or of death, etc., etc." I think then what it does, it has this kind of independent quality of being able to kind of give rise to thinking. It's this thing. It's forever mobile. It can't be pinned down. It's not something you can't analyze it, like you were saying, like you were trying to do semantically. You can't say, oh, the child is being beaten. It's not. It gives off this meaning. I think what we're coming at here is it's given off is this extra being, which is now the terms of the pure event expressed in the infinitive, this is what he's always said. This is what I think it's a third characteristic, if I remember rightly, of the phantasm, that it's to do with the verb.
So
he says I'll just quote. I've just found it. Unusually, I've just opened a page and there it is. It says that the paradox inheres a particular element of a proposition. This element is the verb, the infinitive form of the verb. Phantasm is inseparable from the infinitive mode of the verb, bears witness thereby to the pure event. I think this is what's being spoken about here, is the pure event. The kind of role of the subject within the expression of this. I mean, I think the author, like Proust, is someone who sets this in motion, so to speak. This is what they do. This is their role. Why he talks about the other authors who are referred to. The phantasm seems to have this kind of almost like a life of its own, in a strange, very peculiar way.
So if we go back to Abraham and Tarok and their idea of the phantasm, basically what they say is that the phantasm is kind of like the fragmentation of subjectivity in the unconscious, and that the phantasm, these fragments of the subject in the unconscious, say, seeing yourself as a child in a dream or something like that, that they're always equal to the thing which is in the id. And so as the subject fragments, so does the id. And then these things get buried in this crypt, which becomes the unconscious. And so I think that what's interesting about what Deleuze is doing here is he's taking this concept of phantasm and saying that there's kind of like a parallel between that and thought, kind of on this metaphysical plane. And I think that's a really interesting move that he's made, kind of transforming the phantasm into thought, and say spiritual culture in the the history of philosophy or something like that is really this phantasmic projection on some kind of metaphysical plane.
So could you describe the phantasm as a kind of a primordial existential ontology at the beginning of that? Because you mentioned the shattering of the subjectivity, but it is a kind of rudiments or of a subjectivity, you know, and
Well, this is what Abraham and Tarok are saying.
yeah,
And I think that what's happening here is that Deleuze is picking up this idea of the phantasm from them and kind of transforming it to his own use in describing this kind of extra being, or this level of the event, or the level of sense that kind of hovers above bodies.
yeah, right, right, yeah. Because yeah, because he refers to it as the the sight of the eternal return. It mimics the endlessly the birth of a thought, and a new begins a new desexualization, sublimation symbolization. Caught in the act of bringing about this birth. It sounds very how Heidegger describes the primordiality of one of the existential ontology of the it calls it Dasein, but it's kind of like the pre pre-reflective consciousness or something like that. The way Sartre describes it. It's maybe like the sense of self-awareness that the child develops, right? You mentioned the child being beaten. There's a kind of self-awareness there, right? The beginning of that sense of self-awareness.
It's kind of interesting to think, Deleuze was writing Difference in Repetition, and then he wrote this book. And this book is kind of like the breaking free of his thought into a new realm from from the kind of study he did in Difference and Repetition. And so the two books are like bound together. And the interesting thing is that in Difference and Repetition, he uses Heidegger's idea from what is called thinking, that what's most thought provoking is the fact that we're not yet thinking. And so in that book, he uses that as kind of a way to get into talking about stupidity as a um, kind of philosophical category. And but here, he's gone over to saying that we can think, but when we are thinking, we're thinking on this metaphysical surface, which is tied to sexuality and can't get away from it, and basically is involved in symbolization and sublimation all the time. But uh, but it's just interesting to kind of compare the two books and their uh, their different takes on what thinking is about.
Sorry. So I can't really say very much following that. I just feel this is. I think we see this a lot in Deleuze. He kind of ends up. It's a very again. It's kind of very becomes very descriptive of the outcome. What comes out of what he's said already.
I think I might have been right when I started talking about the brain surface. It seems like he's going back to thinking about the brain as a surface with its hemispheres and its chiasmic relation to the body.
Well, I just to continue the section you're focusing on, Brooks. Earlier, he says the genitals. He says, well, he asked the question: which side is everything going to tumble down, to fold or unfold? Because the erogenous zones are already engaged in combat upon the sexual surface. Combat that the genital zone is supposed to arbitrate and pacify. He says the genital zone. So this the erogenous zones engaged in this notion of the zones engaged in a combat upon the sexual surface, which is supposed to have been arbitrated by the genital zone, but the genital zone itself is the arena of a larger contest. So there's this larger contrast between the mouth and the brain is larger than the one erogenous zones. He says, so he used this idea of zone. So the mouth is not only a superficial oral zone, also the organ of depth. So he's obviously continued this notion of depth and surfaces, etc. So he says the mouth is not only a superficial oral zone, but also the organ of depth, the mouth, anus, cesspool, and projecting every morsel. This notion of introjection and projection is to do with what the child does in relation to its mother. That's where it was first introduced. Anyway, those two terms of introjection and projection. I said, the brain is not only a corporeal organ, also the inductor of another invisible and corporeal metaphysical surface, which all events are inscribed and symbolized. They have this kind of relationship. So he says, he kind of reverses it. So the mouth is not only a zone, like a superficial oral zone, but also the organ of depth. He says the opposite is true. He says it in an opposite way for the brain. It's not only a corporeal organ, but also the inductor of another invisible and corporeal metaphysical surface, which all events are inscribed and symbolized. Again, this is it's a battle, another area in the two. Yeah, because I would say inscribed is obviously to do with kind of being embedded within them, but symbolizing that they're subjected to thought. They made something other than or they're associated with something else. So between this mouth and this brain, everything occurs, hesitates, and gets its orientation. So he's bringing this whole structure back to this relationship between the mouth, which has this the organ of depth, but also the superficial oral zone. It's a zone of the surface. The brain, which is only a corporeal organ, but inductor of the metaphysical surface. So this is a battle between the two, but it says it's only the victory of the brain if it takes place, free the mouth to speak. So in the sense that I would, well, I don't know if I'm going too far, but it seems to me what you could say from that the mouth becomes free to speak in terms of what does it say? It's probably expressing thoughts that have been given rise to in this kind of this movement of the phantasm. So the victory of the brain, if it takes place, frees the mouth to speak, frees it from excremental food and withdrawn voice, and nourishes it with every possible word. There's this kind of coming together. So the brain takes over. So it's the metaphysical surface of the brain enables speech to take place, which is in line with the idea of thought. What is the role of thought? How is thought expressed? Through the mouth. It has to be taken away from its trying to think its cesspool, from its introjection and projection, the depth, I would say. I'm just looking at the final sentence of the previous paragraph. He says the event is properly inscribed in the flesh and in the body. So I think this is probably why I imagine he then this whole thing reaches it concludes with this relationship between the brain and the mouth. He says that so the event is properly inscribed in the flesh and in the body, with the will and the freedom which befit the patient thinker. In virtue of the incorporeal part containing the secret that is the principle, truth, finality, and quasi-cause.
Here's where I'm going to interject and say that what you just read there reminds me, and to my own surprise, where Deleuze is starting to resonate a little bit with Michael Henry, around the flesh and the body being a place, a being where the event is experienced, and also tying that together with this question around the mouth as being an important source of thought. This is where the discrepancy would arises with the material phenomenology of Henry, because the event and the body would be in direct relation to thought, and that the mouth would just be a place of articulate, to where it sort of does the cutting around a particular joint or flesh of the event. And here Deleuze is also pointing out to the brain having mastery over the mouth, and I think that again, he's pointing in the direction the body of his thought is moving, has turned in the right direction, but he is then brought back and distracted. And lastly, I would say on kind of a Lacanian note, that it may have that there's a purloined letter in the very last word there, and that rather than it have, and that missing letter is the word L, where it shouldn't be possible word but possible world. That's kind of what caught my attention, that there's a kind of reinterpretation that may be necessary there, and that purloined letter could be referring to life and love too, which is the affective state from which all this sexualization that Kant has pointed out and has been talked about, where everything is reduced, for lack of a better phenomenological word, back to this sexual surface, but really that sexual surface is still a symptomatic kind of phantasm that generates out of the underlying beginning, that again, from what I'm starting to learn about, or flock 2, which is this phenomenological necessity of the affect that is also in thought. So sticking with the Deleuzian point, though, the point of the event and its tying to the body is a very interesting novelty there. I don't know how often he's really emphasized that in this particular series, but we have something there, and in the end, again, this possible world that the brain and the mind and the thought is connected to, um, finds its way being cut about uh, through the mouth.
I'd like to mention this sentence: the entire biophysic life is a question of dimensions, projections, axes, rotations, and foldings. And I put in the chat a hypothesis that I came up with that this book is built around these dimensional analogies, where you have three-dimensional bodies, and then you have the surface, and then the crack is a line, and then he talks about the around the crack there's these ants moving in and out between the depths and the heights. So those would be the points. And so I just like to mention that it's really interesting that he has these kind of dimensional analogies that he's using in this.
Right. I mean, yeah, I was just going to add, yeah, that those are significant to the topological frame. The discourse on topologies, he's referring all, I mean, that's all part of topology. I'm just reiterating.
And Anti-Oedipus will be perfect for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.